All right, we're live. Let's just start. This has been just an absolute remarkable day in the Middle East and really, for the world. So let's introduce ourselves first. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the host of Global Dispatches, this very podcast, speaking with.
I'm Matt Duss. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy and former advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders, and longtime friend of Mark.
And I'm a longtime fan and friend of yours as well, Matt. I've been following your work since we were, in our 20s. And now,
We lads at the American Prospect.
yeah, way back in the day. Well, I am so glad to be speaking with you in particular, Matt, today, because I know how, you know, passionately and deeply you have been following this issue for decades. And this is just an absolute remarkable day, as I said, in the Middle East. I just want to start with where we are at this exact moment in time, 2 p.m. Eastern, Monday, October 13th. Just about 25 minutes ago, there wrapped up this session in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, in which Donald Trump spoke before dozens of world leaders following the signing of a document, the contents of what we don't know exactly are included in what they signed yet. And I do want to get to your understanding of what might be in that document. But it was signed by Turkey, Egypt, the UAE, USA, and Qatar. And then Donald Trump held court in front of dozens of world leaders, everyone from Prabowo of Indonesia to Mark Carney
Yeah.
of Canada. And it was just this really, to me, remarkable gathering of world leaders. And I want to ask you what you see as the significance of the fact that so many world leaders of a diversity of
Yeah.
countries were there at that moment in Sharm el Sheikh today.
Right. It's just first off, as you said, an amazing day just because it really does now seem that the war in Gaza has ended. Trump has made clear that that is his goal. Um, this is something that Netanyahu opposed repeatedly, and made clear after agreeing to Trump's peace proposal a couple of weeks ago in the White House that even in addition to the caveats that he got written into the proposal, that he would seek to continue the war after getting the hostages back. But Donald Trump, first of all, in accepting Hamas's response as a yes, and subsequently the way he's saying the war's ending, just the war's ending, has made clear that Netanyahu may have very, very little wiggle room here. So that I think is really important. Again, not being in the usual practice of praising Donald Trump for a lot. I do think getting this agreement was important. We should also acknowledge that he supported this catastrophic war, for 10 months of his term leading up to this, or sorry, 9 months, whatever it is. Um, but still here we are now. This ceremony today at Sharm el Sheikh, at the invitation of Egypt's dictators, Sisi, who Donald Trump has referred to as his favorite dictator.
Mhm.
um you know obvious real concerns with the Sisi and a lot of the people who were at this ceremony today. But still, the fact that you did have all of these leaders from the region and beyond showing up to kind of put their stamp, to kind of invest their kind of countries into this peace agreement, I think is important. Not just to show kind of global and regional support for it, but also for Donald Trump. Again, not in the practice of wanting, Trump to get lots of praise for lots of things, but I do think just for getting this agreement, he does deserve some recognition. But more importantly, to sustain this agreement, to make sure that Trump remains personally invested in seeing it succeed, personally invested in real peace in Gaza and beyond, I think is really, really important. So, to the extent that this ceremony, even leaving aside what details are in the actual documents, and like you, I'm not exactly sure beyond just general contours of peace moving forward were in the documents, but just getting Donald Trump on board and keeping him interested is really important.
Yeah, that's interesting. Having a general idea of everything that can go wrong from this
Mhm.
point forward, which you and I will discuss in a moment. When I read about this potential ceremony in Sharm el Sheikh, my initial reaction was that this kind of has like mission accomplished vibes. That
Yeah.
moment when George Bush landed on the aircraft carrier to
Yeah.
declare
Right.
the end of the Iraq War, when really like the bad stuff was just around the corner.
Yeah.
But as you said, like the spectacle of this, the
Right.
fact that so many leaders were there, gathered under the banner of like, Peace 2025, really does suggest to me, and again, knowing how much Donald Trump likes the spectacle, that this is designed, at least in part, to sustain his personal interest in seeing this through and
Yeah.
to kind of widen the aperture of who is invested in making this a success.
Right. That's right. First of all, giving Donald Trump a big, spectacle of a ceremony, things that he is known to really love. But also, yeah, to get as many countries and leaders personally invested in peace in Gaza, peace in the region. Obviously, getting the captives out of Gaza, the Palestinian captives released as well, which many are being released now. But of course, getting aid and coordinating the restoration of humanitarian aid into Gaza as fast as possible.
I wanted to get your take on how we got to this point. Previous ceasefire attempts had failed, including one that, Donald Trump inherited at the start of his term. What's your assessment of why this appears to have succeeded at long last?
Yeah, well, I would say, first of all, I know that inherited is something that we've heard about the January ceasefire, given that Trump was not in office yet. So technically, it was signed under the Biden administration. Donald Trump deserves credit for that ceasefire as well. I have no doubt, well, I have very little doubt, that we would not have gotten that ceasefire if Kamala Harris was about to take the oath of office. That was Donald Trump making clear through his envoy, Steve Witkoff, that Donald Trump wanted a ceasefire before he was inaugurated president. And that's why we got it. I think the Biden administration can, rightfully claim to have designed it. In its basic contours, it resembles, the ceasefire proposal that Biden himself made in May of 2024. We also now know that it was very similar, as is the most recent ceasefire, to a proposal that Hamas had actually accepted in September of 2024. But anyway, I am, again, a small amount of credit to the Biden administration for designing the agreement, but the reason we got it is because Donald Trump was about to become president. The problem was that Donald Trump didn't do then what we are hoping he will do now, and that is stay interested and continue to sustain pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Because as we know, that agreement, the January agreement, had multiple phases. Phase one was release of a number of hostages from Gaza, release of a number of Palestinian prisoners, and a massive influx of aid into Gaza as phase one. And in the meantime, over the course of that phase, the two sides would work out the details leading to a permanent end to the war. Netanyahu, at the end of that first phase, decided, I'm going to walk away from this deal and simply return to the war, which is what he did. Now, Donald Trump could have, told Benjamin Netanyahu not to do that. He didn't. He basically let Netanyahu get away with it for whatever reasons. Um, he does not seem to be willing to do that now, at least from the way he's talking about this as a permanent end to the war. He did threaten, if folks remember, in the Oval Office a few weeks ago, when he and Netanyahu announced that they had come to an agreement and now they would be presenting it to the Palestinian side. He did say, if Hamas doesn't agree, then Israel will have my full backing to finish the job or whatever. But fortunately, Hamas responded in such a way that Donald Trump decided to take this as a yes. So again, the question is, will Donald Trump remain invested and kind of sustain pressure on Netanyahu and prevent Netanyahu from tanking this ceasefire deal the way that Netanyahu tanked the January deal?
Yeah, and it seems, and I wonder if you agree with this assessment based on a lot of the reporting I've seen, that really what changed for Trump was Israel's bombing of Hamas offices in Qatar, which both took Trump by surprise and also was shocking to the extent that one, the Qataris and Trump have a very close relationship. Remember, this is the same regime that's buying Air Force One for Trump. The U.S. has a large military installation in
Yeah.
Qatar. This was shocking and seemed to really anger and perturb Trump to the extent that this is what I think ultimately compelled or forced or changed Trump's
Yeah.
mind about
Yeah.
Netanyahu's
Yeah.
intentions here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's a couple. I mean, first of all, yes, it definitely showed, as if there was any question already, that Netanyahu was seeking yet again to undermine negotiations by, assassinating the people he was supposed to be negotiating with. Um, and who the Trump administration was negotiating with. I mean, we know now from reporting that the Trump administration, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and others have engaged directly with Hamas representatives. I think that's long overdue. It's very important. So yeah, this was happening at much less of a remove than previous rounds of kind of Qatari brokered negotiations, as has often happened in the past. Qatar, yes, Doha is where some of these Hamas representatives are hosted. Qatar has played a peace brokering role in a number of conflicts around the world. It's kind of what they see as a role that they can play in global affairs. Um, but yeah, first of all, it was just the surprise of that attack, the fact that it failed. Had it succeeded, we may have seen, or at least succeeded from Israel's own definition. I think Trump still would have been pissed, but he might have reacted differently. Um, but then we also saw not only outrage, rightly, from the Qatari government, but from a number of other regional governments, particularly in the Gulf. The Emiratis and the Saudis and others who have not been closest friends with the Qataris, but still the idea that Israel was now striking within a Gulf Arab capital was, understandably freaked everyone out a little bit. But interestingly, they seemed able to kind of capitalize on that moment of chaos and outrage to really kind of together. And I think these meetings took place on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly a few weeks ago, at the end of September, where they said to Donald Trump, "Okay, this is really getting out of hand. You need to step in." And put pressure on Netanyahu to push him into a ceasefire to finally end this so we can all start reconstruction and move on, and that does seem to have had some real traction with it.
Yeah, it is notable that the timing of this all did coincide with the opening of the UN General Assembly, and in his remarks just now, Donald Trump did say that this agreement came together during UNGA, which is something for listeners of my other show, To Save Us from Hell, we discussed in our episode that we released last week. So you can kind of draw this kind of TikTok of events from the bombing of Hamas's headquarters in Qatar to UNGA to the events today. Um, so obviously there is so much uncertainty going forward. There's a litany of reasons of how and why this deal can fall apart. We don't again know what's like in that agreement they signed, but we do have a sense, and I'd love to get a sense from you of number one, like what needs to happen from this point forward, and where are some of the key kind of inflection points in that sort of series of events going forward where this may all fall apart.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of them. I mean, the first stage obviously is captives out of Gaza, captives released from Israeli prisons. Um, and I'm going to call them captives because a lot of these are Palestinians who were simply rounded up with very little, if any, due process. In fairness, there are also a number of Palestinian prisoners who have been convicted of acts of terrorism, of murder. But a majority of those Palestinians being released are not, or at least set to be released. Um, and then, of course, there's the entry of aid into Gaza. Israel will stop impeding the flow of aid as they have clearly been doing. Um, and then we get to the really, really hard stuff is, okay, how and when does the Israeli military pull back? Um, how and when does Hamas begin to reassert their control over Gaza, which we already see them trying to do now? We've had some reprisal attacks from Hamas forces on Palestinians. Really, really outrageous watching Hamas reassert its control. Unfortunately, I don't know of anyone who thought there was a different outcome. I would certainly love to see a different outcome. I think the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine, more generally, deserve to have a government that that has their interests at heart. Um, you have Israel, which again, first of all, even before October 7, we know this, for a fact that Netanyahu and his government supported Hamas's rule in Gaza because it helped them keep the Palestinian national movement divided. During the course of the war, they formed relationships with a number of kind of armed gangs and family organizations, in the hopes, I think, quite vain, of supporting some alternative force in Gaza that could compete with Hamas. Um, that's obviously going to just lead to more violence, more destabilization. But it does, I think, get to one of the core problems here is that the Israeli government still has zero interest in empowering um, Palestinian self determination. Netanyahu says repeatedly there will be no Palestinian state. His right wing partners, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben Gvir, have been explicit about their goal of removing the Palestinians and resettling Gaza. I mean, even the leader of the so-called opposition in Israel, Yair Lapid, will not support a Palestinian state. He essentially, his solution is a kind of we'll kind of just put new curtains on the reservations, on the Bantustans, and then Palestinians will be able to govern themselves, and they'll have to be satisfied with that. They won't be satisfied with that. No people would be satisfied with that arrangement. But that is a problem we're going to have to confront because if the goal is to kind of disempower Hamas, which is, what I agree with. You can't do that under a situation of Israeli military occupation. You can't do that in a situation of complete hopelessness for the Palestinians of any end to the occupation. You cannot do that in the absence of any political horizon that shows them that the alternatives are going to provide a better future. And unfortunately, no one is really showing that right now.
On this question of like who governs Gaza, who controls Gaza, there was in this, Trump 20-point plan, and it was referenced on stage in Sharm el Sheikh, moments ago, the idea of some sort of international security force that would help, fill a security vacuum that Hamas like probably will fill in the next
Mhm.
few days.
Yeah,
And again, I mostly cover the UN, and there have been instances, in which like the UN Security Council authorizes a peacekeeping force, and it takes a long time
yeah,
for troops to actually like muster and
yeah,
deploy. Governments typically are not, that willing
mhm,
to want to send their troops in harm's way, and this is an extremely dangerous mission. And there's like a whole, social science at this point around how to do post-conflict reconstruction, how
mhm,
many troops you need per population, how to
yeah,
do DDR, which is, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of former
yeah,
forces. This is like a
yeah,
process.
right,
And to me, the big gap here seems between like what's needed on the ground in terms of like maintaining, a security architecture
yeah,
and the lack of any troops forthcoming for that.
yeah. No, I think that's right. And listen, there were efforts to kind of think this through all over the past 2 years, including by the Biden administration. They never got really far on it because they never were, they were never willing to, in my view, willing to, apply the appropriate amount of pressure on Netanyahu and the Israeli government that would have made it a realistic thing. But also, there have been ideas from others, and again, Netanyahu has resisted this. He's resisted and still resists the idea that the Palestinian Authority could come in at some point and govern Gaza, which ultimately, again, my criticism of the Palestinian Authority, as certainly Palestinians do themselves, but they are a preferable, governing body than to Hamas. But ultimately, I think you need a government by, of, and for Palestinians, preferably Gaza's Palestinians, to make this really work. My colleague Omar Shaban, who is from Gaza, who's a fellow with the Center for International Policy, he wrote and we published a year ago a proposal for a governing body for Gaza. At in when we have a ceasefire, people can look for it on our website. I think it's still very realistic, but it's kind of foundational piece is that this needs to be a government that is drawn from the people of Gaza, people, that Gazans trust, people who know Gaza. And so even though we can find examples of international peacekeeping forces that have, you know, that have worked out, as you noted, this is a particularly horrible situation. Hamas is already reasserting itself, and it's hard for me to see, you know, how an international peacekeeping force, certainly in the longer term, is going to be able to make things better. So I think we really do need to be thinking about how do we move as quickly as possible to a Palestine that is governed by Palestinians.
What do as we said earlier, the Trump administration, at least today, seems very invested in the success of this ceasefire.
Yeah.
In the near term, what ought the administration do to ensure the, continued, success of the ceasefire, which is,
Yeah.
less than 24 hours old?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it really does come down to Trump. I mean, the more he keeps saying like the war is over, the war, we are really investing in peace. We want peace now. And not giving Netanyahu any wiggle room, um, I think is all to the good. But I do think if the goal is sustainable security, and this is where even though the Trump's document does make reference to, Palestinian self-determination and the usual kind of ultra caveated, maybe someday down the road, if XYZ things happen, there will be a possible road to a path to whatever. They need to get much more explicit about that. And whether we're talking about one state or two, I mean, I'm aware as you are of all the arguments, a two-state solution no longer possible. Is it not? I don't know. But just the idea that Palestinians have a right not to live under military occupation. Palestinians have a right to self-determination. They have a right to liberation. And that is what ultimately this policy is aimed at facilitating.
In the near term, though, as you noted, Hamas does seem to be reconstituting itself
Yeah.
out in the open again
Yeah.
in the context of the short
Yeah.
ceasefire. What are some near term, um, you know, options to deal with that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have any great answers here. Um, Obviously, the Israelis could not erase Hamas over 2 years of war, despite devastating, just completely obliterating. Anyone can see the pictures. But we knew at the end of the Biden administration, I mean, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, on his way out, said that as of January, Hamas had reconstituted, had basically recruited as many new fighters as had been killed by the Israeli military. So, as distasteful as it is for a lot of people, and I understand that, there needs to be recognition that has been and will be a part of Palestinian politics. I think having an agreement for a government where Hamas does not formally play a role, but there could be, technocrats and others who are approved essentially by Hamas, or at least Hamas agrees not to oppose them. That's been in past proposals. That's part of Omar Shaban's proposal, which I mentioned. Um, but at some level, you need to recognize that Hamas will retain some level of a veto over what happens in Gaza. You cannot like it, but we need to figure out how to work with that.
Um, Lastly, there is this idea of like a board of peace that Trump sits atop of.
Mm.
Um,
with Tony Blair. Yeah.
Potentially Tony Blair, although he seems to be, I think there's been enough opposition to
Yeah.
him at this point that maybe he's no longer in favor.
All right. That's great
Um,
news.
um, but I'm wondering, if, there is a role for like an amorphous quote unquote board of directors to oversee a peace plan? And if so, like what would that role be, and who ought
Yeah.
to be part of it?
Well, no, as I said, I mean, ultimately, I think if you're talking about a board drawn from Gazan Palestinians and
Yeah.
Palestinians, period,
I
that is
don't think
something.
that was the
No,
intention though,
that's
isn't it?
clearly not the
Yeah.
intention that Trump is talking about yet.
Yeah.
And it's clearly something that the Israeli government would absolutely oppose, right? Because they are utterly in opposition to any meaningful Palestinian self-determination now or in the future. But still, hopefully someone will be able to make it clear to Trump, like, listen, you have achieved something important here. If you want this to keep going, if you want this peace to endure and expand, not just in Palestine, Israel, but throughout the region, as you say, you do need to come around to this idea that the Palestinian people need to be represented, they need to be bought in, and Palestinian factions need to be bought in to this arrangement. Now, that's not an easy sell. Who knows how much of these, many of these details Donald Trump is even aware of? I expect not very many. Um, but if you can make it clear to him that like this, like this is now part of your legacy, and if you want it to endure, these are some steps you need to take.
Lastly, is there like a question I didn't ask, a point you wanted to make? I know you obviously, you've been following this
Mhm.
forever. So I just want to give you like an open opportunity to make any point you'd like to make.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I want as no one more than the people of Gaza want this to continue and to endure. I also think just as an American, I think I really want us to be taking a hard look at how we not only let this happen, but we helped perpetrate this over 2 years. I've been, as someone who had some hope early on that the Biden administration might see how bad this was going, as we could all see very early on, and then might pivot away from just that complete bear hug of Netanyahu. That never happened. Um, I really do. I don't want us to just kind of move past this. Um, this was an absolute catastrophic failure of U.S. policy, of U.S. leadership. The damage to, the so-called rules-based order that you and I have spent a lot of our professional lives thinking about has been like enormous. Just the kind of the rules of war, the rules of civilian protection, that even before October 7 were often honored just in the breach, are now just they lie in complete tatters. And I do think we have to be thinking in much more specific terms about what real accountability looks like, what kind of possible investigation, Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we never got for Iraq, that we never got for the war on terror. Accountability is a thing that barely exists in Washington, if it exists at all. But I really do think, especially Democrats, the Democratic president is the one who oversaw the vast majority of this catastrophic war. We really need to think about how we are going to hold Democratic foreign policy professionals accountable.
Well, Matt, thank you as always for your time and your insights on this really, again, remarkable day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark. Great to see you.